Hello, and welcome to Nonprofit Program Planning and Evaluation. I'm Charles McElveen, and this is Lesson 2, Theory of Change. We'll be targeting the need assessment, purpose, and problem statements. The outcomes for this lesson first is to create a problem statement. That's to get in there and dissect what you need to know about your setting and the impact it has on your participants. The second outcome is to be able to assess the community and the participant needs. And you're going to be using both subjective and objective methods to do this. And the last outcome from this lesson is to compose the purpose statement, which is to present that overarching goal of the program. And that is going to focus upon the underlying condition. So first we need to answer the question, what is a theory of change? Now, there's several components to this, and the first of that is it links your program outcomes and activities in a way that explains how and why your change is expected to come about. So it's pretty much a hypothesis, and it's a very high-level hypothesis. Again, you're trying to target how and why you think you can bring this change about. The second part of this is that you could start with a program and work backwards, but it's best when you're going to start off with a goal and deciding what approach you need. So you start with the end in mind versus starting with what approach you may already have in your organization, what service you may already have in your organization. Basically, what you're doing is you're starting with a person's itch and then finding out what is the best way to scratch that itch. Now, with a theory of change, it's going to require a justification at each step. In other words, you have to be able to make solid connections from the very beginning to the very end of why you believe things are going to work out the way you think they're going to work out. And we call this the logic or the outcomes pathway. And one of the most important pieces of this process is to make sure you don't have any gaps in that logic. As we go further through the course, we'll unpack more about the logic pathway and identifying the gaps. And then lastly, with the theory of change, we will be considering to what degree a precondition needs to be met for success to be achieved and to explain why it worked or did not work. Now, what I mean by that is that you may have an outcome and then the preconditions for that, for instance, may be it could be a short-term outcome, it could be an intermediate outcome, it could even be an activity that's necessary to bring apart or to bring about the outcome. You have to explain why you believe that connection is important, and not only why it's important, but also where you've placed that precondition in the process. So it's not only what you're going to do, but it's when you're going to do it, and then be able to explain why you are going to do it. Now, here's an example of a theory of change. Now, this example is brought about by the Kellogg Logic Model, and you can find this in the Kellogg Logic Model Development Guide. And this is an example of one organization that created a theory of change based upon a housing process. So to zero right in on the problem or issue there in box 1, you identify that problem, then you go to box 2, which is to identify the needs, then 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, etc. The idea here is that you're moving sequentially from the beginning or the origin all the way to the outcome. And then you explain in each one of these steps along the way why you are doing what you are doing, why you're selecting what you are selecting. Now, here is the logic pathway. So in this instance, we have a long-term outcome. And when you're discussing, logic model types of language, logic models will break this down a little differently. So you may have a long-term outcome, and that'll remain the same. But here in the theory of change, the necessary precondition is well, what needs to happen in order for that long-term outcome to come about? So logic model language, you would say, well, that would be the intermediate outcomes. Okay, well, for this necessary precondition, what has to bring that about. So down here in this level here, this will logic model language, this would be your short-term outcomes that bring about these intermediate outcomes that bring about the long-term outcome. You can continue drilling down levels and say, well, what is the precondition to this precondition? So, well, the precondition is you have to have an activity to bring that about. So here's the language over here: activities, short and intermediate term outcomes that must be achieved before the long-term outcome. So again, it's a sequence of activity where one step leads you to the next step. No gaps in between. Here's an example of, for instance, the Citygate network. This is a theory of change that they've developed, and you can see right there in the center, the most important piece here is it all begins with a person becoming saved. So from that point on, all changes, everything that happens in a person's life begins to go through that filter. That's the beginning point. In missions, we may call this redemption and lift. In other words, when a person is saved, they begin to see the world differently. And that begins to change their inner viewpoint, their philosophy of living, which then drives different changes in actions, which brings about different changes in a person's condition. So you can see here that we start off with saved, and then we go to sober. So this will be in the context of, for instance, addiction recovery. Person becomes more stable. They become schooled. Then they attain skills, which means more secure living. Once they are more secure in their living, then they can go on to being settled and serving. And serving is pretty much the big goal. And all these together, you can see that shelter and food is the relief part. Then we have a rehabilitation. We could call that development, relief, and development, coupled and ending up with this capstone here of aftercare and transition. There's some organizations out here that just do a really great job with this. You may want to look at a Sunday Breakfast Mission that's got this documented really well. City Union Mission has it documented really well, just as an example. All these things together are the long-term outcome. So collectively, they all work together to bring about this long-term outcome. But basically, someone having a more abundant life than they used to. So let's look at the evidence briefly of the theory of change. So having a really tight, well thought out theory of change, the goal here for this organization was that recovery program graduates will remain sober after 1 year of graduation. So when they did their research, they discovered that really there's three things that are super important to bring about this success or the realization of that goal. And they found that, well, jobs, housing, and supportive church community, you have those three things in place, they've got an 80% chance of meeting that goal. And that's done by evidence. So they've done the research to bear that out. So you can imagine there's some trial and error here, and that's okay. That's part of the process. They also found that success rate without these supports is only about 10%. So in their theory of change, and for someone to end up being sober, that's their long-term outcome, and that's even after they leave the program. They need to have those three things in place. So everything in their program is about making sure that those three things are in play. So now let's unpack this a little bit more. So what is a problem? You've got a lot of reading to do, and I really suggest you spend some time inside of Kettner's book, because the Logic Model Development Guide doesn't do a great job fleshing this out, but Kettner's book does a really good job getting into the philosophical basis of not only what is a problem, but then begins to discuss it from a social problem aspect. So at the highest level, what is a problem? Well, Alan Bremen, he states the problem is just an area of concern, a condition to be improved upon, a difficulty to be eliminated, or a troubling question. So those are the types of things that can become a problem. Now let's flesh that out a little bit more. So when you begin to look at what is an actual problem, we saw those prior elements It all starts with identifying a social condition. And that's just a factual statement of something that is, without any sort of interpretation and labeling that goes with it. And then in step 2, then you reframe it as a social problem. And again, Kettner's book does a really good job in getting to the basis of what is a social problem. And then you identify the gap, which is step 3. And then lastly is you provide a justification for action. So coming back to the identification of the social condition, it's an existing circumstance, a situation, or a state of affecting a person's life, welfare, or their relations. And again, that's just a factual statement of what is. And then you begin to say, well, okay, well, why is that a problem? And that's where the interpretation comes in. So it's a qualitative statement. There's no necessarily numbers attached to it. You're just trying to identify what the standard is, possibly, and then you're going to label that and interpret that. So, for instance, what poverty has varying. We'll use the term poverty, for instance, and the federal government will say, well, here's the standard of poverty, but the thing is that the standard of poverty, that label, varies depending on the size of household. And it can also vary when it comes down to perhaps a particular locale or a place in the country. And then the interpretation of the condition, it could be when you start comparing that to other conditions around that, for instance, homelessness and health, or homelessness and food security, etc. So reframing the condition as a social problem is the next step you take. And then you would identify the gap. And here you can see it's a quantitative statement, and that gives hard numbers. So what you're doing is you're comparing the existing to other areas. Now, it's really helpful to make sure that you're trying to compare apples to apples as much as you can. Make good comparisons. So for instance, the incidence of homelessness in Miami could very well be likely different than it could be in, let's say, Nebraska. So Miami, Ohio versus Miami, Florida. So making sure that you're using good comparisons as much as you can so you don't develop spurious comparisons. And then lastly is this justification for action. And it's a therefore that actually is going to come full circle back to this social condition. Let's put all that together in an example. A recent survey carried out by a county's Department of Human Service estimates that of the 10,000 families living in the Morningside neighborhood, 2,000 families had income of less than $18,000. Okay, so there's your statement of condition. It's factual. There's no labeling. There's no interpretation. There's no standard that's contained in that statement. That moves on to number 2. So right here in this second sentence, we have that comparison. So these families are living in unsafe and substandard conditions below minimally acceptable levels for this community. Those levels are the standards to what we were comparing previously on the previous slide. You've got a label of what's considered acceptable, and these families are living below that. And then the interpretive point comes in, well, it's unsafe and it's substandard. Next, we move on to the third component, which is the gap. Furthermore, this rate of 20% is twice or almost twice as high as that for any other neighborhood or area in the county. There's your comparison. And then lastly, number 4 is your justification for action. Therefore, resources should be targeted to Morningside to raise the level of family income. And that comes right back to the statement of condition up here. The 2,000 families had this income of less than $18,000, and it's because of that they live in unsafe and substandard conditions. So there's your example. All right, so we discussed what a problem statement is and the components. Now let's talk about different ways you can get there to help you understand all the pieces that go with this problem. There are 4 different ways you're going to get there. And over here on this side, we have external means. Now, external is just that. It's not intrinsic to a person. It's extrinsic. It's things you can see, taste, touch, smell. It's that physical world. And then when you think about needs-based, community needs assessment through objective or external research, this is kind of the norm. Community needs assessments as taught in most universities and books through interviews, surveys, and research. Now, that doesn't mean it's not valid because it's taught in a university. All we mean by here is that universities will propagate this method, and it's a very valid method. One of the most probably profound things you can do is do what's called a windshield survey, which is simply driving through a community and noting what is there and what isn't there. Now, the asset-based of that, or I should say the asset-based approach to that, is asset-based community mapping. And again, we go back to universities and books, but you can also do this. You can take that discipline and map the resources that you see in a community, which is, it's very easy today with Google Maps. You can zoom into an area and label the different assets the community has. For instance, small businesses are a great indicator of how robust a community is. We can reverse that and say, well, if you've got lots of assets in the community, for instance, you've got lots and lots of social service organizations, that's not so great because you're concentrating poverty. You've got about the only thing that exists in that area is things targeting social needs, not businesses per se. Then we come over here to the internal side, and that also has two components. We have needs-based, which is subjective assessment of needs from indigenous leadership and cultural immersion. Now, this is a big one right here, immersion, because you're able to define needs because you're living in the community. This is one of the R's we have of, for instance, Christian community development, which talks about relocation. And this is when a person, and we see here as an example, Latino, Latina, you could say black church, etc., inherently knowing the needs of community. And when I say inherently, it's because they're so immersed in it that they are very aware of what the needs are. They have eyes, in other words. And it's not just the church leaders. It's any leader. It's any person in that community that inherently knows what the issues are within that community. And there's another way of working around this, and this is the assets, of being able to capitalize and leverage the assets in a community. And again, I'll go back to the CCD principles here, or CCD principles, Christian Community Development, of being able to say, okay, what do we have here, and what can be a beginning basis for perhaps pooling our talents, pooling our resources, working together to say that we would like to improve our community or to get around a problem, solving a problem from within. And again, it's not just the leaders in the community. It's pretty much anyone can be able to start to walk around their community, again, being in the community, and say, well, gee, what's here? What can we capitalize upon? All those together is going to give you the best picture of how to map out your community assessment. And so this is going to give you a great picture if you start to think through, well, gee, what's our problem? And then we get to the solution. This asset section up here could be fantastic when you're thinking about how to develop solutions for the problems in your community. Let's turn now to the purpose statement. Okay, so you've identified the problem. You've been able to go into the community and hear what the needs are through different what means, and you've also looked at what the assets are within the community. And now you're ready to say, okay, well, what are we going to do next? How are we going to meet this problem? How are we going to solve this problem? So the first refers to the program's overarching reason for being in big picture form. Why are we doing this? Overarching reason. It makes it clear what the program is trying to achieve or trying to facilitate in the lives of those who take part in it. So your purpose, why we're doing what we're doing, and how clear can we be in describing how we want to facilitate change. And the third thing about the purpose statement is it sets the tone of what the organization is going to do. And then it also, by nature of talking about how it's going to facilitate change, it starts to provide hints of what the outcomes are going to be and what activities you're going to conduct. And if you keep thinking through that process, it's going to be, okay, well, what resources am I going to need to carry on this activity to bring about this outcome? And lastly, the key in setting the program purpose here is to have a general picture of the result in broad, aspirational, inspirational terms. This sounds contradictory, but it's not. You're not drilling down and getting super specific. You have an idea of what you're trying to accomplish. You've got the tone set, and then you want to be aspirational and inspirational, and that will be part of what you're trying to, or it will be what you're trying to move towards as you work on this program. Here's some examples. The sheltering program, the Union Gospel Mission Twin Cities, is the goal of, or the purpose of their programs are support that leads to self-sufficiency. So this is basically a supportive housing type of model here. That it's clear, the future, they want to see people be self-sufficient. And they're going to do everything that they can to help a person become self-sufficient. And it's pretty general here. So when they got in, when a participant gets in, that's when they begin to assess individual needs. Here's educational services in Shelter, Kansas City. And their purpose is to provide customized support. So that's what they're going to do. And for what purpose? It's to aid in the total transformation of each resident and the development of a new network of supports. There's really two prongs here. It's to provide customized support in transformation and support. Those are the two prongs of this purpose statement. Now, so you can see that they're somewhat specific. They hint at what's being required or what they're moving towards, while on the other hand, they're still able to stay somewhat general as well. And then active recovery here to Jimmy Hale Mission. It's going to be helping helping residents understand and overcome the very issues that contribute to their substance abuse. So their purpose is to help people understand and to overcome. That's the two big points right there. And it goes back to a condition of substance abuse. And you can unpack, all the things that substance abuse will end up causing. Homeless issues, health issues, food insecurity, etc., etc. Okay. So that's it for this week, and we'll be talking to you in the next session.